So my name is Julio Huato. I am a member of the editorial board of Science and Society, which is the journal of Marxism in the English language that has the longest publication record in history. So we are at scienceandsociety.com. The editor is David Lehman. The associate editor is Christine Monroe. We have other principals here like Barbara Foley, Russell Dale, and many others, members of the Manuscript Collective and editorial board. I would like to thank St. Francis College, my employer, because they are providing us with a Zoom platform to conduct the event. This is the second of our online speaker series. Our guest speaker tonight is Vijay Prashad, who has been already talking. He's gonna give us a lecture for approximately 1 hour on U.S. imperialism, the standpoint of its victims. And then in the second part of the event, we're gonna open the floor for questions, comments, answers by the speaker, and overall discussion. If some attendants are not comfortable showing their faces on the screen, please, you can shut off your camera. Feel free to do that. Also, if you want to pose a question and you don't feel comfortable on the microphone or on the camera, you can type it on the chat section. We'll be monitoring that. Vijay is a well-known Marxist, historian, journalist, international socialist organizer, executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and he also is the chief editor of Legworth Books, a publishing house based in New Delhi. He's been an academic in the United States and more recently in the Middle East, if I understand correctly, in Beirut, to be specific. He has published dozens of books, including most recently Washington Bullets, with a preface written by former Bolivian President Evo Morales, and also another book, Red Star Over the Third World, published by Pluto Press. Other important books include Red October, The Russian Revolution and the Communist Horizon, Communist Histories, Volume 1, Letters to Palestine, published by Verso, Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, also by Verso, with a foreword by former UN General Secretary Boutros Ghali. Some of us receive regularly his Tricontinental newsletter. Vijay has been an advocate and a promoter of socializing or sharing or globalizing the best practices of socialism wherever they may emerge and develop. Even socialists in the rich countries can benefit from following closely and critically absorbing the experience of socialist insurgencies in the poorer areas of the world. And Vijay, with his work, is contributing to making this increasingly possible. So here's Vijay Prashad.
Okay, Julio, that's an amazing introduction. Thanks a lot. I'm glad you're taping this session, and that's lovely because I'd like to listen to it again. And every time I'm depressed, I'd like to hear it again. So it's great to be with you. I don't presume to, speak at a high level of theory, friends, because that's your job. I'm not going to tell you things you already know, but I'm going to try to tell you some stories because at best I'm a storyteller, and I've practiced as a journalist for 35 years, and that's really my work. I want to actually start with the story I was going to tell you about the CIA agent, and then I'll work backwards to what I think you may be interested in discussing. So a few years ago, many years ago, actually for the last 15 years, I've been chasing a story about the murder of a US ambassador in Afghanistan. Now, most likely you've never heard of this, that a US ambassador was shot to death in Afghanistan, in Kabul in 1979. It's not a story that is been widely written about. And I was thinking of writing a book called The Assassination of Adolf Dubs, and that's his name. His real name is Adolf. The Assassination of Adolf Dubs and the beginning of the War on Terror. Because Dubs was killed, as I said, 79 in Kabul. And I'm not going to tell you about why he was killed. It's a fascinating story, but I've traveled all over the place. I talked to the former chief of security of the last People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, who's sitting in a prison in Kandahar. I interviewed him. He looks completely like a shadow of his former self, very much. Interviewed lots of British intelligence. And eventually I found my way to an elderly man in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we met at a very nice restaurant twice. He was the head of operations for the CIA from Afghanistan out to Beirut, and he was running the show initially from Tehran. But you know, he would go everywhere. So I met him, and I spent, you know, many hours, if I add both together, talking about not only Doves, but what was he up to as the director of operations in this very crucial area at a very important time. You know, 77, Pakistan, there's a coup d'etat. 78, the SAR revolution in Afghanistan. 79, the revolt in not only in Iran, but of course in Pakistan, where the US embassy in Islamabad was also captured, an event not really remembered. It's not just the US embassy in Tehran that was held, but also in Islamabad. And what were you doing? I asked him. And every time I asked him about Doves, he would say to me, stay away from that story. He said, I'm warning you. And he used to wear a big overcoat, and I was afraid he was carrying a gun and then would shoot me in this Cambridge, Massachusetts restaurant. He would, very chilling voice, he would say, stay away from that story. And then he said this line, which I thought should come on a memo typed on an old Remington typewriter, you know, with a big red banner on top. Because he used to say this line, which sounded to me like a typewriter being, you know, giving me the line. And the line was, you have been duly warned. And I thought, that's amazing. You have been duly warned. For what? I'm interested in the murder of a US ambassador. This is before, you know, Chris Stevenson was killed in Libya. There was another ambassador killed. And I'm not going to tell you the story of that, but it's a great story. And he said, you have been duly warned. And in a sense, really, that's what they always tell us about imperialism. The state says you have been duly warned. And then, you know, smart people in places like the United States say it's a figment of your imagination. It doesn't exist. You know, there's just lots of things happening. There's no system. Because if you consider that there's a system, it's a conspiracy theory. Anytime you try to systematize US power, it's a conspiracy. You know, Bolivia, for instance. Well, you know why Evo Morales was removed? Because he was a gangster and he needed to be removed and blah, blah, blah. Leftists, a journal called Towards Freedom, scandalous behavior, published a series of pieces attacking Morales in the middle of that coup. I wrote to people at the board. I even wrote to the editor, and they said, oh, we are for a diversity of left opinion. Interesting diversity, because every single article published, they attacked Morales. Every single article. That's what they call a diversity of opinion. Very interesting American leftists. Very interesting. You know, core part of the US left. Towards Freedom, you know, and many very good old comrades on that board. They didn't say a damn thing, because guess what? It's for a diversity of opinion. That's what we're for, fellas. A diversity of opinion. A government led by the first indigenous head of government in Southern Cone Andes area. Okay, there's Benito Juarez. I understand my history, but Evo Morales plays a very important role. 14 years after wretched colonialism that devastated the people of Bolivia for centuries. I mean, guys, this is really the heart of Galeano's superb open veins of Latin America. There's Potosi, there's the mines, there's the 52 revolution, crushed by whom? By Nazis, real living Nazis, including Klaus Barbie, moves to Bolivia, creates a secret service. The Nazi creates a secret service in Bolivia, and it's that guy trained by a Nazi, Klaus Barbie, who kills Che Guevara in 67, 9th of October 1967. I mean, this is what you're dealing with. You know, we need many opinions on the left. Morales arrives there. 14 years, he improves the well-being. Nobody contests the well-being of the people of Bolivia was greatly improved in 14 years. By the way, his third term didn't end until January 2020. So even though they may contest the fourth election in November 2019, he should have been allowed to complete his term till January 2020. He was removed from office November 2019. I didn't hear very many American leftists stand on principle and say he should be allowed to complete his term. Do you remember anybody saying that? I'm not talking about the higher reaches of the New York Times. I'm talking about the American left crowd. The Squad, for instance, and so on. You know, where are your principles? His mandate for the third term was to expire in January 2020. He was drummed out of office by a US liaison officer on November 2019. I know this because I spoke to them 2 days before the coup happened, and then Chomsky and I released a statement the night before the coup saying they're going to do a coup, and how much we were attacked, Chomsky and I. Chomsky was attacked because, well, he's just an old senile man being taken advantage by me. Guess what? Chomsky is neither old nor senile. He's going to live another 100 years. The man has principles and integrity. And when I called him and said, Noam, his term ends in January, he said, that's enough for me. He said, we are not interested in what happened to the election of 2019 because the term ends in January. If anything, he should complete his term. Do you understand? That's a person who accepts liberal principles. Where was the American left when Evo Morales was drummed out of office? We have enough evidence on the surface of US imperialism, but we're not allowed to say it's a system. Because if you say it's a system, then you're a conspiracy theorist. Welcome to the world. Is there not a conspiracy to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela? No, it's not. They're just things happening. Maduro is authoritarian. Well, he's not as good as Chavez, we hear. Chavez was something, because leftists like to go shopping when they discuss leaders in the third world. We like somebody, we don't like. It's a matter of your personal taste, I gather, not the sovereignty of a country. It's a matter of your personal taste. You like Chavez, that's great. You don't like Maduro, let's get rid of him. Let's join with the Yanks to go and bomb them. I don't like this guy, I like the guy. I don't know what kind of attitude that is. Even I like Chavez. But that's not the point. The point is they have a sovereign process. On August 4th, Elliot Abrams, a high-minded person of great principle and a diversity of opinion should suggest that Elliot Abrams merely is exercising his own singular opinion, today chosen not only to have in his hand the Venezuela file, but also with the exit of Mr. Brian Hooks, the Iran file. Something you should be chilled about, because this leads me to believe, not because I'm a conspiracy theorist, but because I'm a little intelligent, I think, that Trump, to save his prospect of getting re-elected, is going to do some sort of bombing run on Tehran somewhere. It may be a police action. Let's call it a police action, what they did to Grenada. Every time the United States president attacks another country, there's a 15 to 20% bump in their poll standing. Somebody is well advising Trump. You got to get some generals behind you. A quick police action, Biden, that's not even a competitor, honestly. So be chilled. On the 4th of August, Elliot Abrams sits there in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Every member of that committee attacks Elliot Abrams, and I commend to you going to C-SPAN, that god-awful place. Or if you don't have the stomach for C-SPAN, because there's like an hour of tape before the actual video begins, you can just go to the Senate hearing on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee website. And you can watch the hearing and you'll see Rand Paul and Mitt Romney, the great liberal Mitt Romney, and you'll see Chris Murphy and others attack Elliot Abrams. But you might wonder, what are they attacking Elliot Abrams for? I'm just saying attack. I'm not saying what. What are they doing to this poor man who's sitting there taking all this, grief from Republicans and Democrats? They're all attacking Elliot Abrams. Now, interestingly, you'd think that attacking Elliot Abrams, who was a convicted criminal for lying before the US Congress, that's their body, around the Iran-Contra affair. You might remember this. Elliot Abrams himself is a lawyer, so he cannot defend himself by saying, I don't know what's going on. You're a lawyer, Elliot. You were not even disbarred after you lied to Congress. You were convicted, and you were not disbarred by the United States judicial system. Am I the conspiracy theorist, or is this a conspiracy of elites? Tell me. The man lied and was convicted. They had a disbarment procedure, and they declined to disbar this man. So then he enters almost every administration after that. Am I making this stuff up? I mean, is this out of my feverish imagination? Am I reading the sewers of the internet for this? No, this is there in the Wall Street Journal. This is there in the Washington Post. I'm not reading the gutter of the web, to get this stuff. This stuff is right there. Elliot Abrams, you were convicted. Do you deny it? No, I don't deny it. Elliot Abrams, do you accept that there was a disbarment procedure against you? No, I do not deny it. Elliot Abrams, were you disbarred? No, I was not disbarred despite all that. Now, Mr. Abrams, you're running the Venezuela file. You would think that these people in the Senate were attacking him because he's a scoundrel. No. They were attacking Elliot Abrams because he, running the Venezuela file, had not overthrown the government of Nicolas Maduro. Every one of them, from Rand Paul to Mitt Romney to Chris Murphy, for God's sake, Chris Murphy, the darling of liberals from Connecticut, senator from Connecticut, not from, Texas or wherever these other god-awful senators come from, Kentucky. No, this is the darling of liberals from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, attacking Elliot Abrams, saying, you have failed to bring down the Maduro government in open session. This is not a secret proceeding. You can watch this on the internet. And then he says, in April, we tried a kind of coup. Tomorrow, Erica Ortega Sanyo and I are publishing a piece called A Kind of Coup. We interviewed the Venezuelan foreign minister and said, what did you think when you watched this entire hearing? And Arezia was just like, what am I supposed to think? What am I supposed to think? Rafael Correa had the best comment about this. He said, this guy probably even didn't know what he was saying. He did not know what he was saying. This is the arrogance of American imperialists. He didn't even know. He said, we tried a kind of coup over there. By the way, is the United States a member of the Organization of American States? Just a check question. I mean, you're all intelligent people. Is the US a member of the OAS? Well, it's based in Washington, D.C., and indeed, the United States is not only a member, but is the suffocator-in-chief of the OAS. So the United States actually has signed the charter of the OAS, one of the founding members. Many people, like Fidel Castro, used to accuse the OAS of being a front for the United States government. Indeed, I think that's putting it kindly. It's essentially a front for US imperialism. I mean, not just the government. That's its basic policy orientation. If you go and look at chapter, I believe it's chapter 4. I'm just speaking from memory, but it's chapter 4, article 19, 18, somewhere there of the charter of the OAS. It very plainly says, you cannot use armed force against another member of the OAS. It very plainly says, in fact, you cannot use economic violence against other countries and so on. You have to respect the sovereignty. Here in open session, this is not an interview given on the side where he can say I was misunderstood. He's saying this into the Senate's record. This is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Chris Murphy, a liberal Democrat, darling of the liberals, says we tried a kind of coup. And he's saying it, why didn't we try a better coup? Why didn't we try a better coup? We had everything. We had this charisma. He says charismatic. Juan Guaido, charismatic. I'm not sure. Not charismatic to me, honestly. But he says this in the thing. We had a charismatic guy in place. We had other, countries ready. We had 60 countries around the world sanctioning Venezuela. 60, by the way, out of, if you remember, 193 countries, not a majority. Just because the US is behind the 60 doesn't make it a majority. 60 out of 193 countries in the world back US policy on Venezuela. He says, we had all that and we didn't succeed. He said, a kind of coup. Total violation of the OAS charter, a violation of the UN charter, but they just talk like that. You see, that's just open session. And we are the conspiracy theorists. They said, we are trying to do a coup in Venezuela. You might also remember that Trump, in Bolton's book, you must read John Bolton's book. It's really entertaining. In Bolton's book, Trump says, Venezuela is part of the United States. That's a banner line. Venezuela is, exactly, you're right, Trump. That's exactly how the United States government sees its backyard. Venezuela is a part of the United States. Bolivia is a part of the United States. Ambassador in Bolivia in the early years of Morales' time, US ambassador, said that quite openly, that our interests are much more important. Our company's interests are more important here than anything the Bolivian government says. They are quite clear about all this. But no, in the American left and in academic circles, people will run their heads through the washing machine trying to be subtle about everything. What's the need to be subtle about this, friends? I'm asking you, how do you analyze this session on the 4th of August in a way that has many opinions, all sides represented, all the currents? I mean, these guys are saying, we want to overthrow the government in Venezuela. Now, do you really need to have a debate about the character of the Venezuelan government? Is that really germane? I mean, is that germane? Like, you can disagree. I disagree with the uh, character of the government in Iran. Totally disagree with it. But I totally say that they don't have, nobody has a right to overthrow that government in this way, by bombardment and by external force and sanctions and so on. Just because I don't agree with the government in Iran doesn't mean I agree with the exercise of American imperialism. This was Fred Halliday's catastrophic error with Iraq in 1990-91, when Halliday catastrophically coined that term, where he called it, I think it was Islamofascism or something, which then that renegade Christopher Hitchens used regularly, to slam anybody he didn't like. Okay, it's up to you, Chris. You decide which countries should live and which countries should die. You play God, Chris, not me. Okay, so on the surface level, we very much know that there is this imperialism. What is it for, though? I mean, why does the United States? Well, there are differences. US power exercised and Canadian power exercised in South America is very different than US power exercised against China. We have to make distinctions. I agree. The agendas are quite different, and the role of imperial force on the service of, let's say, Western capitalism is very different in different places. So it's very clear that when Raju, what's his name? Because you're in Toronto, I'm asking you this. What's his name? The man who was the head of that Canadian mining, biggest Canadian mining, Barrick Gold. The School of International Studies in University of Toronto is named after him. Every time I see that name, I want to just throw a rock at it. Huh? Monk School? Yeah, Monk. Peter Monk. That's it, Peter Monk. When Chavez first came to power, and by the way, you remember, when Chavez actually came to power, it was through a cascading series of elections. He failed in a coup. The coup attempt, uprising failed. He went to jail. I remember going to Venezuela when he was in jail, doing a bunch of stories there. It was catastrophic. The left was totally disjointed. He comes out of jail and he says, let's build a political movement. And then they win this enormous election. You remember this, 1998, enormous election. He comes with a mandate. One election after the other. I mean, not just the mandate to win, but then the referendum, the constitutional referendum, I mean, there were so many elections. I used to tell my editor, because I was covering South America, I'm sorry, I can't keep up with what's going on in Venezuela. There's just too much democracy. Too much democracy. It's like an inflation of democracy. I don't know what the election is this time. I can't keep up. So anyway, Peter Monk writes in, what's it, the Toronto Star and Globe, or Globe and something of the hell, whatever, that Toronto newspaper. Monk writes in this newspaper, he says that interesting. Very interesting when people use that word. Is he talking about Barrick Gold? After all, he was the head of Barrick Gold. Who's we? Canada? Canada is a wretched country, pretends to be liberal, has, I think, 60 to 70% of the world mining companies are located in Canada. And in the project to overthrow the government of Maduro in Venezuela, Canada is leading the Lima Group. It's not the United States. It's that beautiful Justin Trudeau, who's a scoundrel, leading the charge on behalf of mining companies. This is not for human rights, friends. It's strictly mining companies. Who is we? Is it Barrick Gold? Is it Monk just thinking that he's God, or his family? Is it Barrick Gold? Is it the Canadian government? Is it other mining companies? Is it capitalism? Is it the West? I mean, who the hell are you talking about? Is it the white West? I don't know. You just fear that this indigenous man has taken power in Venezuela. It shouldn't be there. It should be a person who looks more like you. I mean, I don't know what they had against him, but in this thing in the Toronto Globe and Mail, he writes, we need to get rid of this authoritarian. Now, why was Chavez an authoritarian? He just won a whole bunch of elections. Why? Because he was not allowing companies like Barrick Gold to set the terms of the resource contracts. The Venezuelans said, no, this is the limit. You can't, we'll deal with you. It's a commercial transaction. We're not expropriating you. But you cannot, this is the percentage we are going to take. Otherwise, just go. And Monk was pissed off with Venezuela. There's a huge controversy. Recently, again, somebody has accused me of manufacturing the idea that Bolivia had a lithium coup. I never actually said it had a lithium coup. That was Evo's line because he was saying it on Twitter. My position was that Evo was moving a resource socialism agenda, and that was out of the question. By the way, it's not just lithium, it's also this thing we have right here. It's indium, which makes the screen. Bolivia has very large resources of indium, which makes these screens. It's indium, it's also lithium. Now, it's also true, as I wrote 2 days after the coup, because I'd followed the lithium story, that ABC, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, all have lithium reserves. And in fact, Chile is cheaper to get the lithium out of there. Bolivia, it's harder. It's up in the high plateaus, harder to evaporate it. That's all true, but there's still very large, considerable deposits of lithium. Lithium is key for the battery. That's why Musk made that really intemperate Twitter statement where he said, "We'll coup anybody we want," you know, and that's why his company was open negotiations with Bolsonaro to create a electric car factory in Brazil and have lithium. And this was Samuel Doria, who's running with the false president of Bolivia, Janet Anes. Doria wrote on Twitter that, Musk, come and take our lithium for your factory. I mean, these people are horrendously scandalous. The difference between Samuel Doria, who takes to Twitter begging an American company to come and plunder the lithium, and Evo Morales, my friends, is the difference between the future and the past. And that's what people like Towards Freedom in the end were saying. We prefer the past to the present, because after all, the present has problems, or the future has problems. I mean, disappointing, deeply disappointing, not to see the wood and the trees when both are right in front of you and say it's neither wood nor tree, it's just a shadow. It's not the wood nor the tree, it's just a shadow of a tree. Don't be mistaken. By the way, today's the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima. Speaking of extraordinary violence, it's just a shadow. Remember that bomb killed people and left their shadows on the street. Sometimes the shadow is all you need to see. Okay, so Monk says, we need to get rid of the authoritarian. I mean, that's interesting. What makes him authoritarian? And this is where we come to the term hybrid war. Hybrid war is a term that our institute has been really plugging, because we think that, well, I mean, I'm not going to get into it at length because we've published a lot of stuff. It's all free on our website. We've published a lot of stuff analyzing particularly the hybrid war in Venezuela. But hybrid war, of course, has got old roots. There was always information war, always economic war, and so on. But the rate of technological growth has increased the possibility that you don't really need to destroy a country by bombardment. You can destroy it with the hybrid war. You can sabotage electric networks because everything is now on the web. And the Venezuelans feel that their electricity network is consistently beaten by hackers coming from outside. Now, I don't know, are those Russian hackers? Why would Russian hackers go after Venezuela's electricity grid? It's more likely it's the NSA. A quick side note, and I'll get to China in a second. And I know, Julio, another 10 minutes? Yeah, 10, 15 minutes. And quick side note, I'll come back to China, but quick side note. You know how interesting this hybrid war thing is? Here we are, the whole world's Western press. I hope you took my phrase seriously. The whole world's Western press. The whole world's Western press is very concerned that Huawei is going to steal your privacy. Very concerned that your privacy is going to be stolen by Huawei and then eventually the Chinese government. Meanwhile, anybody's paying attention. And you didn't actually need Edward Snowden for this. You really didn't. But Snowden helped. I don't know if you read any of Snowden's stuff. Anyway, as they say in America, anywho, if you read Snowden, you'll know that the largest spy agency in the world is the NSA, the National Security Agency, which is, the Chinese government's spy agency. It's enormous. Chinese government have this thing called the NSA, which sits in, where does it sit? Shanghai, and they spy on the whole world. Well, obviously it's not a Chinese government agency and it's not in Shanghai. It's a bloody American outfit, the NSA. And we have, because of Edward Snowden, on record that Google, Microsoft, all deliver your information and my information directly to the NSA. They're already taking our information, but the world's Western press is aghast. It's aghast. It's truly aghast. It's taking the vapors, as they used to say in the 19th century. It's taking the vapors because they're fainting in fear of Huawei taking your information, which has been protected for you by Google and the NSA, because they're looking out for you. Google and the NSA are your defenders, your white knights. They are not imperialists. You know who's an imperialist? The Chinese government. That's what we mean by hybrid war. How easily they flip things around. And they make you afraid, oh my God, China is going to steal our secrets. And then you can just bomb China. The hybrid war, in other words, information warfare, sets the terms for the bombing run. The bombing run is secondary. It's the last thing. You don't need to do it. You just need to convince people that China is the greatest threat to the planet. Look at them. They'll steal your data. They will steal your data, which is protected for you. Don't look at Snowden. He's a traitor. Even when Google openly says, yes, we collaborate with the NSA, because they have gone on record saying, we deliver information to the NSA. You see, YouTube, for instance, owned by these great barons of commerce, when it's RT or CGTN, they write at the bottom of the video box, this is sponsored by the Russian. Warning, I don't know if this is warning. Warning, it's injurious to your health. It's sponsored by the Russian government. Warning, injurious to your health, sponsored by the Chinese government. I mean, shit. I mean, in fact, the great thing about America, MSNB, the government doesn't need to sponsor us. We are State Department propaganda. We don't even need sponsorship. CNN, we don't need US government funding. We're such great patriots. Look at these foolish CGTN and RT. You know, the only reason they spark propaganda is because they are paid by the government. American, you know, the world's Western press, meanwhile, doesn't even need government support. They fall on the sword willingly. That's what Google does with the data. That's what Microsoft does with the data. They don't need even anybody to go and tell them, please give it to us. They give it away. They fall on their sword willingly. This is the hybrid war, guys. Suddenly you believe Rachel Maddow is one of the great journalists of our time. Rachel Maddow gets on TV and says the Russians are coming for you. When the Americans went for the Bolivians, where was Rachel Maddow? Stand on principle, sister. You're going after Russia for interfering in US elections. When the United States government does a coup in Bolivia or in Venezuela, where are you? Why don't you do one show? One show, just one, not even a show. Sorry, I don't know why I'm being so greedy and maybe even arrogant. Just do 5 minutes, or not even 5 minutes. Just say a sentence. The United States government should not interfere in the elections in Venezuela, which will be held later this year. And the August 4th hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was about the forthcoming elections in Venezuela. Because opposition says we will boycott the election. You'll boycott because you'll lose. Now, we know that with South America, it's largely the attack on resource socialism of one kind or the other. It was an attack on ALBA, on the attempt to create regional solidarity, to de-dollarize through the Sucre, the attempt to build a different foundation for South American interregional trade. And we can talk about this later. I think there's a lot there in ALBA that should be studied. You know, just because you're defeated doesn't mean you're wrong. I believe this with the socialist project in general. Just because the Soviet Union collapses doesn't mean communism is wrong. Defeat doesn't mean, defeat is not a judgment on your accuracy, on whether you're right or not. Defeat is a judgment of strength. That's different. It's a totally different register. You can win and be wrong. We've seen that many times. The United States overthrew the government in Iraq. Was the United States right? Did that make the US correct? I don't think so. I'm not sure. Maybe you feel that. I don't. I wish there was another outcome for the Iraqis, still struggling. Okay, China. Last point, Julio, on China, and then we can chat. I'm sorry, I'm not a systematic person, and I didn't make a paper. I didn't write a paper, and I'm not a systematic person. I told you, I just tell stories. And these are, don't take it seriously if you don't want to, but if you'd like to, it's up to you. I just look at the world and I wonder how we, continue to live on it. Every few years, I write on Twitter that I would like to be abducted by aliens. And that's because aliens have better technology than us. They're able to go across the galaxies, which means they must be socialists, because capitalists will not be able to do intergalactic travel. They're too busy rapaciously destroying their own planet and attacking each other in imperialist wars. Whereas a socialist planet would figure out how to cooperate and do the best with the resources. And I'm, by the way, not a Posadist. Don't mistake. My last name is not Vijay Posada. The Posadists, they're these insane leftists who believe that the aliens will come and destroy I've forgotten exactly what Posad said, but he was insane. No, I'm just joking. But the planet is in appalling state, and these are some of my reflections. China. One of our first texts we produced at the Institute is called In the Ruins of the Present. And it's a very quick read for you. It's not, it's an assessment essentially. It's available at the website. You can download it for free. It's in about 10, 12 languages. It's a very simple problem that it's trying to solve, which is it's trying to understand the architecture of the 21st century. We look at, for instance, some key ideas of how the world is organized. So there's a section on globalization, a term that I like to use because I think that's exactly what happened with the disarticulation of production, with the centrality of intellectual property rights, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The reason intellectual property rights is such an important part of globalization was once you disarticulate production, you don't control your blueprints and how things are made, because you've got factories all over the world, and industrial espionage much easier. The idea of reverse engineering products can be easily done, and so on, which is why they banned reverse engineering, if you remember this, in the last GATT round, in the TRIPS agreement. It has a section on neoliberalism. It goes into what we call the tax strike. The elite has gone on strike. They refuse to pay tax last 50 odd years. It goes into the investment strike. When you disarticulate production, big firms don't need to invest in production. They subcontract a lot of stuff, and then you get small capital around the world, let's say in Haiti, mid-level capital investing in small factories that sew shirts for the Disney corporation. Disney invests nothing in there, so we call that the investment strike. You have enormous profits coming into these companies. They put it into the financial casino, a term that Fidel Castro used to like to use. There's so much money swishing about because these people are not investing their money. You know that. I mean, since 2007-8, the Federal Reserve opened the tap. Money is basically free. The money is not being invested. Banks are holding on to it. They are basically what we call constipated. They are holding capital for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes in liquid form, sometimes it's invested in financial instruments, and so on. $32 trillion is the minimum amount we've calculated sitting in tax havens. That's a considerable amount of money, 32 trillion. We have a section on imperialism and so on, but I'll pause. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. You can find it and read it. The reason I wanted to bring this up, in 1978, when China began the reform era, it's a much misunderstood era, and I don't want to go into it in much detail, but I would like to say that in Poorer Nations, I wrote about the South Commission, where Julius Nyerere, very concerned that intellectually the countries of the South simply didn't have the intellectual capacity to deal with what was happening. The Brandt Commission had failed to talk about inequality. There was a meeting at Cancun in '81. Ronald Reagan was the star of that meeting. He just laughed, joked. At the airport, he made such swift jokes. He said, you people, they're not poor. You just need to come up with good ideas and work hard. And people laughed. And, it was the end of, it was terrible. I mean, Willy Brandt was heartbroken, honestly. They'd worked hard to produce the North-South report. They arrived in Cancun. The Mexican government was 100% behind some discussion. Guess why? Because they had to just file for bankruptcy. You remember this in the third world debt crisis. This is '81, Mexico goes into receivership. So here we are. We're at this period when Nyerere says we're lost. We don't have an idea. So they empanel the South Commission. Nyerere is the chair. Manmohan Singh, later the Prime Minister of India, is the General Secretary of the Commission. I went through all their papers, which are sitting in a bomb shelter in Geneva. I spent a very great time sitting in that bomb shelter, going through all the documents which had the minutes of the meetings and the debates. The Chinese delegate was very interesting, kept insisting, listen, fellas, he kept saying, we are going to go into this project in a different way because we want science transfer and technology transfer. From Pakistan, the person who was there at some of the meetings was a physicist, Abdul Sattar, and he said, look, don't just ask for the transfer of technology, you've got to transfer science. If you're not doing pure science in your countries, you'll be lost. You'll just get yesterday's technology. You have to create tomorrow's science, not yesterday's technology. You have to go 2 generations ahead in tech. The Chinese in that meeting said, we are not going to allow investment to come in unless there's science and tech transfer. I found this very useful because when eventually they set up Shenzhen, after Deng Xiaoping goes to Singapore, meets Lee Kuan Yew and says, how did you do it? I mean, it's a fantastic meeting. He meets Lee Kuan Yew, says, how did you do this to Singapore? I get Singapore is a small place, but we're interested. Lee Kuan Yew says, these are the 10 things. Deng Xiaoping leaves and says, not interesting. Not interesting, why? Because it's the port, and because they are under the US umbrella, nuclear shield and so on. We need tech and science transfer. They didn't do that. You know how in the WTO in the last 10 years, the French photovoltaic cell, the companies have been trying to sue China in the WTO, saying they stole our intellectual property, and the Chinese are really, but wait a minute. Remember this contract you signed with us in which you agreed to science and tech transfer as the price of coming and exploiting our labor? Remember this? Well, we have it. That's the signature of your CEO. So I don't know if we stole anything because you gave it to us. China today is the world's leader in the production of photovoltaic cells and so on. Interesting, and I'm not going to get too much into this, but interesting. After the 1996 deregulation of the Telecommunications Act that deregulated telecommunications in the United States, investment in high tech in the US declines dramatically. These fellas get used to the investment strike. They are pilfering profits out of telecommunications companies and buying islands or going on holidays with Jeffrey Epstein and so on. That's the kind of thing they do. They haven't, because of the telecommunications deregulation, firms are not willing to invest. They basically buy each other out, buy the small startups, but they were not developing the next generation of Internet of all things, 5G and so on. Huawei is not the only company, by the way. There's about 20 companies in China which are about 2 generations ahead of the US in some of this stuff. Silicon Valley is 100% behind so-called liberal Silicon, 100% behind Trump's trade war against China. They are using extra economic force to try to stop China from leapfrogging 1 or 2 generations ahead of the US in tech. They recognize if that happens, the rents that American tech firms have been used to, Apple not the least among them, the rents are going to decline. If you go to India, nobody has an Apple phone. Apple is ridiculously expensive. Everybody has a Chinese phone. When the Indian government said no Chinese apps are allowed in India, that was a ridiculous statement because guess what? China doesn't need to retaliate. You know why? Because there are no Indian apps on Chinese phones. There are simply no Indian apps worth their salt. There are no Indian phones being bought anywhere. If the United States thinks it can pivot lines of production from China to India, got another thing coming. You know why? Indian basic industrial infrastructure, low level. Indian workers underfed and diseased. And I'm saying this because you cannot produce the kind of capitalism that you want when you have the kind of wretched social structure you have in India. You haven't allowed that to be broken. You can't just move factories because India and China are nearby and the ships can stop. No, sorry. Look, capitalism is not just about some calculations on a notebook. It's about human labor. Wow, you're going to have to now admit that Marx might have had a point. You need labor to make surplus value and therefore profit. You can't just do this in your head or some back of the envelope calculation. To have labor means, let's go back and reread volume 1. You need the worker to go home, rest, be well, to come the next day to work and so on. What now is called social reproduction. It's there in volume 1. You need all that. And in India, you can't have that because workers fall ill, because the situation, disease, catastrophic. Workers are illiterate because your literacy rates are low, and you haven't invested in education, you haven't invested in health, you haven't invested in public transport. It's hard to get. If you go to any of these Chinese towns, and I'm talking now Wuhan, the epicenter of the coronavirus, Hubei province is really the center of German manufacturing. Wuhan city as well is like, if you go, there's tons of German factories that ring Wuhan city and Hubei province. So guys, China must be stopped. Why don't you try to out-capitalist them? Why don't you try to produce better shit, man? Why don't you produce better fucking, sorry, excuse me, better 5, 6G? You can't even produce 3G, 4G. You're so behind on Internet of Things. You can't do it. I mean, look at, forget it. Nobody's flown in a plane in years. Every time I fly into Beijing or Shanghai, or even provincial airports, you know, the airport functions perfectly. You fly into JFK, sorry, the snorkel is broken. You got to walk 3 miles because, you know, something happened. And I mean, infrastructure, basic infrastructure collapse. You're spending zero in infrastructure. Try to compete with China on a capitalist basis. Oh my God, they're doing colonialism in Africa, the Chinese. Wow. Nobody has done colonialism in Africa before. Nobody. Africa was just a terrific place till the Chinese showed up. I went to Zambia. I asked, Zambia and the copper belt, enormous production. I talked to trade unionists in the copper belt region asking, the Chinese were bidding for this factory. This is very interesting. Chinese were bidding and they said they'll do all these things, schools, hospital, roads. Obviously, we know it's not for humanitarian reasons and so on. They're trying to get the bid, etc., whatever. But what's the American bid? The American bid is the president is called to the US ambassador's house. That's the American bid. If you don't give our people the contract, we'll see you at the IMF. When you come back, when the mission returns from Zambia, when they go back, and you're going to have to you wait and see what happens to you. Now, what's imperialism? It doesn't exist, actually. It's a fiction of the left-wing imagination. It's a conspiracy theory. There is no imperialism. There is Chinese colonialism, but there's no imperialism. The Chinese are the bad ones. That's the hybrid war. This is where we are, friends. I hope you'll read my book, Washington Bullets. It's a series of stories about US imperialism. You can get the ebook if you're impatient from leftward.com. Monthly review, the brilliant monthly review. When we told monthly review that we can't print the books because our printer cannot open in Delhi, and plus we are having a hard time getting paper as a consequence of the pandemic. Monthly review just a few weeks ago said, you know what, we will print the book for the US and UK and we'll have it out in September. I thought that's amazing. Fahim, you have the book out there. You've printed it out. Brilliant. Brilliant. Isn't that an amazing act of solidarity by our dear friends at Monthly Review Press? I think that's amazing. Generally, it takes much longer for them to get a book out, but they said, let's do it. And it's going to be out in some weeks from Monthly Review. So if you want to get it, you can order it from there in print or ebook. And it was with a great deal of pride that the president of Bolivia said he would write the preface, because as he said, he was the last, up till now, last head of government to face Washington's bullets. And as when I was, we were interacting, he said, for 14 years, I faced it from the beginning. In fact, even earlier when I was a trade unionist. This is no secret. He said, but at a point they were afraid that they were going to kill him. He said, it wasn't clear. Was it going to be Allende, 1973, or was it going to be Arbenz? Before I stop this, I mean, we have questions, I know, but before I stop, I want to say that Arbenz, Jacob Arbenz was a very fine man. Very fine man. I'd never met him, obviously. He died before I was born. But everything I read, for Washington Bullets, the middle part of the book is on Guatemala. A very fine man, by all accounts. He was not a leftist. He was friends with the leader of the Guatemalan Communist Party. His wife, Arben's wife, was much more a Marxist, leftist. Um, he was taken to the airport to be flown to Mexico City, and he was stripped in the airport. The last act of humiliation. To check him, they stripped him naked in the airport. This is what Castillo Armas thugs did to him. The CIA as well. Armas, after all, was a CIA asset. Horrible person. Put him on the plane to Mexico City. The daughter of Arbenz committed suicide. Arbenz himself entered a scalding hot bathtub with a glass of liquor in his hand. Cheers. And he died. And it was said that he died because he entered a scalding hot bathtub. A horrible way to die. It was never considered a suicide. They said it was accidental. I'm not sure about you, but I don't know how accidentally you enter a scalding hot bathtub. I also don't know how you commit suicide in a scalding hot bathtub. It strikes me as an assassination of one kind or the other. Whether it was by his own hand or not, he was assassinated. So always to Salvador Allende, to Jacob Arbenz, to all of them, including Thomas Sankara, to Patrice Lumumba, to all our friends, long departed, victims of Washington bullets. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Vijay. Thank you. So let's open the microphone.
Hi, my name is Rob Hunter. Thank you for the talk. I wanted to, my question is prompted by what you opened and closed the talk with, which is this conceit that imperialism is conspiracy theorizing. You know, as you said, if any attempt to systematize imperialism is rebuffed by skeptics, as though you're claiming that something is there that's clearly not there. People say, look, like the US doesn't possess vast colonial territories. Look, it's not literally delivering its dictates at the barrel of a gun. How can you say that this is imperialism? But as you've suggested, the US and other states in the imperial core are constantly seeking to secure the conditions for further capital accumulation. And as you've outlined, they have a whole repertoire of strategies for doing so. And what I'm curious about is, in your experience, how are these strategies perceived by people who have to bear the burden of them? How are these strategies perceived by victims? Do victims place these experiences into older frames, like experience it as colonialism, as territorial conquest and aggrandizement? Do they see it in terms of capitalism? Where, you know, how did they make sense of what they are experiencing in countries like Bolivia, in countries like Venezuela, and elsewhere?
Julio, are we going one by one?
Go ahead, please. Yeah,
Okay,
you can
great.
take one by one. Yeah,
Great. It's a terrific question. It's a terrific question. I'll just give you a few examples as an answer. You know, you would have seen that the US government attempted a very hallucinatory indictment of Maduro and other leaders by saying they are narco traffickers. And my colleagues and I, Ana Maldonado, Paula Estrada, and Zoe PC and I wrote a piece where we went through the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA records for the last 3 years, just 3 years. We're not going to be exhaustive, okay, just 3 years. And we looked at where is the cocaine coming from. And the DEA, which is, you know, as you know, Venezuelan government propaganda agency, the DEA comes out and says that 90% plus drugs come from Colombia. They test the drugs in the US and they say, so the American government's drug agency says that the drugs are coming from Colombia. They also suggest in there that Ivan Duque, the scoundrel president of Colombia, is implicated in this. They do mention that sometimes the drugs are driven across the border to be stored in Venezuela when there's an operation against it in Colombia, because the border is very difficult to police. They do admit that. So it actually does enter Venezuela, but just momentarily, then it returns. So the DEA says this, and meanwhile the US government says, no, it's Venezuela, and Maduro is a drug trafficker. It goes against your own evidence. So they send a carrier group of ships, you remember, into the Caribbean. Now, on the 4th of August, they asked, these liberal Democrat senators asked Elliot Abrams, they said, why don't you do a blockade of Venezuela? You know, I was amazed. I was listening to this live, by the way, because I'm that kind of person. I was amazed. The US government officials, you know, elected officials, Democrats saying, why don't we blockade Venezuela? And Elliot Abrams, guys, guess what Elliot Abrams says? He says, we can't do that because it's an act of war. I thought the sensible guy in the room is Elliot Abrams. Rob, I'm getting to your question, but I just want to make the point, Rob, that Iranian vessels, 5 of them, you see, last year, an Iranian vessel was entering the Mediterranean. You remember this? And was captured in Gibraltar by British special forces. They held it illegally and said that this Iranian vessel, which was not an Iranian vessel because it was carrying, I believe, a Maltese flag. It was a false flag, fine, everybody does it. And it was not saying it was going to Syria, but the British captured it and said, you are sending oil to Syria. You remember this? They boarded the ship. It was a famous incident. This time, 5 Iranian tankers left Bandar Abbas with Iranian flags flying. They were not false flag, which is a normal practice in commercial shipping, by the way. So it's not like some weird thing, false flagging. That ship carrying ammonium nitrate to Beirut was headed to Mozambique. It had all kinds of flags. And if you looked at the manifest, there was all kinds of flags. It kept changing flags. This is a normal practice in international shipping because they keep trying to evade regulations. Anyway, the Iranian vessels carried Iranian flags. And from the day they left Bandar Abbas, they declared on satellite, they told the various people that that they are heading for Venezuela. And they didn't shut their radar. I tracked those ships. They came on the radar to Venezuela. Americans didn't stop them. You see, what's interesting about that, Rob, is that it was not a solidarity mission. The Iranians sent 5 tankers of oil. The Venezuelans paid them. It was a commercial transaction, which as far as I know is totally legal in the world. Now, there are some illicit things you can't sell. I can't come and sell you a howitzer, Rob. I cannot. We cannot create a bill of lading and I have a howitzer delivered by that ghastly Jeff Bezos' company. You cannot do that. But I can sell you, you know, a book. That's legitimate. I can also sell you oil, Rob. I can go and buy, you know, a tank of oil and drive it to your house. That's legal. The Iranians were delivering a legitimate commercial, you know, it's a legitimate commercial transaction, pure capitalism. United States wants to stop pure capitalism. You understand that? Because they want to dominate. This is a pure commercial interaction. It's very important we make this point. The Iranians didn't send solidarity oil. That was not, I don't know, the press never actually just mentioned, frankly, this was a commercial transaction. Why should you stop a commercial transaction between 2 countries? I don't understand it. I'm not, you know, pretending to be thick. I actually don't understand it. You know, it's a pure commercial transaction. They're delivering oil. They're not delivering anything illicit. Okay, so there's that. I mean, the point is, 1, nobody's fooled by what the United States is doing. You know, if you look at Correa, his statement, which we'll quote in our piece tomorrow, kind of coup, Correa says directly, this is what we call American exceptionalism. You know, this is what we call American exceptionalism. What we do holds. In China, I had a very interesting seminar interaction with an institute in China recently. In China, you know, they're terrified, at least a lot of these intellects, terrified the United States is going to bomb China. Is going to go to war with China. Is going to impose a war on China, you know, over some incident in the South China Sea. There'd be maybe some bombing run. People actually think that's going to happen. You see, it's not a feverish imagination thing. There is fear. On Guanxia, on Weibo, on all these social media sites, lots of people are talking about the impending US war on China. I mean, this is a real thing. If you read Global Times, I believe Global Times is a good reflection of some of this fear that's there. And Global Times, they're fairly smart people. You know, you may not agree with everything. Wang Wen, for instance, is a very smart intellectual, you know, very top flight person. And Wang Wen, you know, will tell you directly, we fear that there may be an attack. So what I'm saying to you is that people are not mystified by this. I have interviewed many heads of government of countries that basically bend their knee to the United States, and they'll tell you as they're walking out of the room, they'll tell you, listen, we know how the world is organized. Former Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, I've heard him say this many times. Let's just be realistic. You know, they set the terms. We can't have an independent foreign policy. They set the terms. Now, what they're saying is we are not going out in public and going to talk about imperialism and all that. You do that. But, you know, they are not fooled. I mean, people are not fooled. You know, you listen to them. The other thing about we don't have territories outside America is interesting. And I agree with you. In Washington Bullets, I have a whole section about the fact that US imperialism doesn't start in 1898. That I can't believe that US historians believe that. US imperialism starts with the so-called revolution. Because essentially part of that revolution was the bourgeoisie, emerging bourgeoisie and the planter class wanted to go beyond the 13 colonies, kill all the Native Americans. And, you know, the so-called insane George III was like, no, you cannot cross the Mississippi River. And they were like, forget this crazy king. We're going, and that's another information warfare. Was he really that crazy? He was saying, don't colonize the rest. The first colonial territories of the United States of America is America. You know, the war against Mexico, to take 1/3 of Mexico, whatever the site, then to, you know, capture Hawaii later in 1898. But, you know, the territory, to kill all the, you don't need a colony overseas when you have a colony contiguous. Wasn't the Tsarist empire an empire? They didn't need to have, I mean, that's partly the problem for the Russian government now, is their only warm water port. There are 2 warm water ports for the Russian military, which is why Russia is digging in with its nails in Crimea, and Sevastopol is one, and the other is Tartus in Syria. They have no other warm water ports for their military. That means in the winter, if they lose Crimea and they lose Tartus, you know, Latakia in Syria, the Russians will have nowhere to keep their navy in the winter. They'll have to remove their ships from the waters. I mean, that's, or they'd have to go to some other, they have to buy, you know, portage rights in other countries. They don't want to do that. They have 2 ports right now. And that's the flashpoints. 2014, intervention of Russia to defend their port in Crimea. You know, I don't care what's going on, who's Ukraine, that's irrelevant. I know why they went there. It wasn't, it's also the Russian population in eastern Ukraine, I agree. You know, the Donbass and so on. But it's also the port. They needed Sevastopol. And Tartus, they intervened in September 2015 in Syria. I mean, you'd have to be idiotic not to recognize that they needed to protect their port. So, you know, I mean, the Tsarist empire was a contiguous territorial empire. They didn't have too many colonies elsewhere. They didn't need it. England was a tiny little shriveled shrimp of a country. They didn't have anywhere to expand. They had to go take Australia and New Zealand and South Africa, and then eventually, my God, they took India. And then we gave India to them because we are a wretched, useless country with caste structures and all this shit. English came and we said, you must be better than us. Please take over. We are wretched, we are useless. And look now, the terrible prime minister. Some days I say, bring the English back. I mean, Boris Johnson can't be worse than Narendra Modi, who's out there in the middle of a pandemic, bloody inaugurating a hideous, wretched temple on the site of a destroyed mosque by his own thugs. Total mirror image of Erdogan, you know, taking this beautiful building you visit in Istanbul, now making it a mosque again. I mean, these people are wretched. Bring back Robert Clive.
Russell, you have a question? You need to unmute.
Yeah, hi Vijay. Thank you. Your talk was great. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask you if you had seen a couple of weeks ago on the United States' PBS. There was a documentary on the Frontline series about putatively about artificial intelligence technology, and it tried to frame the story as a sort of war of 2 empires, the United States on the one hand and China on the other. And, you know, it was astonishing how much the documentarians sort of went out of their way to give Marx his due getting to such a point that they even said at one point, they had some expert guy say, well, Marx is right. The productivity rises, the price of the commodities goes down and the surplus value or the profits go up. And, of course, we're going to have lots of automation and that's what the future is going to be, a loss of jobs because of automation. And, the guy mentions Marx and says Marx is right. So they bend over backwards to make this point from Marx, but then they go the other way and they bend over backwards to make good and sure that anybody watching the show would know that the enemy is not capitalism and technology, but China. And what we need to be careful for is not technology and capitalism and the capitalist class, the ruling class of the world, but China. China is to be feared. And I don't know if you saw the program, but the documentary, but I'd be pleased to hear your thoughts on it. It got pretty nasty, and some of the points that you made about Xinjiang. I don't know if you mentioned Xinjiang, but about this propaganda about Chinese surveillance, where they never mention. I mean, you said we don't need Edward Snowden for this. You're right, but Edward Snowden is an important point, and they didn't even mention Snowden. Doesn't even come up in this program, which is just astonishing, because if anything is the point, it's exactly that. I just wrote a long letter to some of my comrades about this very point. I just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts about any of that, or if you saw that program.
Vijay, you wanna hold it for a second?
Yeah, please.
Maybe Raju has something related, and then you can go ahead, Raju.
Okay, can you hear me? Is it?
Yes.
Oh, you are muted.
Okay. We hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. I could listen to you, Vijay, for hours and hours. I wish you did not have to finish. I mean, those people who have not heard you before, Vijay is a highly entertaining speaker all the time, anytime. You began with your remarks on the left. I entirely agree with you in a slightly different way. There is imperialism everywhere, but the left, and especially within the Marxist left, there is actually very little talk about imperialism, including in scholarly journals. I just checked in our own journal, which is perhaps the best Marxist journal in the entire world. Since 1987, we have hardly published more than 10 articles whose titles includes imperialism. Look, since 1987. So, and recently, David Harvey, in his debate with Prabhat Patnaik, said, imperialism is not a useful concept anymore because of China. I mean, he has been leading people all over, misleading people all over the world. This person has to be held accountable, really, but that's a different story. I mean, here in Toronto, I hardly hear about imperialism in academia or even in the US. Of course, India, etc., is different. Anyway, so I entirely agree. I actually agree with you, yes, with the overall idea that the left behaves in a very peculiar way. There is imperialism right in front of you, and you don't want to talk about it. So that's my beginning point. You said, my second point is, you said, oh, you did not want to talk about theory, but look, I mean, your 1 hour was pregnant with theoretical points. You were not going to make those points, but listening to you, I was being reminded of somebody called Vladimir Lenin, as well as the theoreticians of imperialism since at least 2000, Ellen Meissen-Wood from Toronto, and Prabhat Patnaik from India, Samir Amin, John Smith from England. So I mean, it was a terrific talk, and it was full of theoretical ideas, although he didn't have time to make those things explicit. But this is my question now. I'm coming to my question. Sorry, William, and sorry, everyone. So what do we do about imperialism at this moment? It is a real problem. Those people who deny or underemphasize imperialism, they must be held accountable intellectually, politically. This is brutal. This is imperialism is everywhere. So my question is this: in a short-term way and in a long-term way, what could Marxist left, what could our workers, or what could everybody do to tackle, to address imperialism and to stop its long march? Thank you.
Okay. By the way, that's my Lenin. And he came with the lamp from Albania. It's an Albanian Lenin, which is nice because he came with a lamp. I think the lamp is the best part of it. Anyway, there's a lot to say here. I haven't seen that PBS series, but I've taken note of it and I shall watch it. Actually, I'm glad, Julio, that you had Raju speak as well, because these are very interconnected. And I'll make 2 points about both comments. One is that there is an overwhelming sense of the benevolence of Western power. There is a sense that Western power is only used homeopathically when it's absolutely necessary. So, for instance, last year, some colleagues and I, not last year, year before last, we were very interested in, some colleagues and I, a year before last, 2018, boy, 2020 has been a terrible year. 2018, I traveled in the Sahel region to Arlit, in Niger, which is a huge dump of uranium. Agadez, which is the world's largest drone base, US drone base. And then we went to Mali. And I wrote about, 10, 15 different journalistic articles about the journey. I tried to cross the Sahara, but I got too scared, frankly. We were going in a convoy and I literally got scared and went back to Agadez. It's really scary. Everybody has dark glasses on, but it's so bloody bright. You feel you'll be burnt alive and people die at large rates. So why I'm bringing that up is because the Americans and the French have set up a border for Europe in the Sahel region. It's called G4 Sahel. This is an actual border. They stop people and they prevent human beings from going north to Sabha in Libya and then onward to Tripoli. And a lot of this is done in the name of Al-Qaeda, but as I found in my stories, Al-Qaeda there is the largest cigarette smuggler in the region. They call themselves Al-Qaeda. Some of them are hardcore, but many of them are just cigarette smugglers. There's also large cocaine trafficking going north. It flies in from South America. There are parts of Gao, for instance, part of the town Gao in Mali, where it's called Cocaineville, because all the big cocaine dealers made their money and they have these garish, ugly houses, just like drug dealers all over the world. Some reason drug dealers, because they can't clean their money up, end up being just ostentatious. It's a tragedy of illicit capitalism. You can't take that money you've accumulated and put it into the circuits of capitalism and clean yourself up. You end up buying gold chains or you build an ostentatious house because that's all the cash economy. And these garish, ugly houses, because you keep having to put your cash back into circulation and you can't take it to a bank. Anyway, so there is this European border, the French, the great French, high culture. They have this border they've set up, a perimeter in the Sahel region. They've moved the border from the Mediterranean Sea into the Sahel. Nobody seems to care. You can write article out of articles. American soldier was killed in Mali, Mali-Niger border. I don't know if you remember this. At a Foreign Relations Committee, one of the senators, I think it's one of those Republicans, forgotten again who he was a friend of Trump, then Trump turned on him. Somebody from the South. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He said, I didn't know there were US troops there. You didn't know. You're in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. United States has built the world's largest drone base in Agadez. I visited it. It's enormous. It's near the extraordinarily beautiful old city of Agadez, which is all mud. And it has this gorgeous mud mosque. It's a beautiful area. It's at the edge of the Sahara. You can smell the dust and the desert. And also if you go slightly north, it's Arlit, as I said, you can smell the uranium. Even in the day, sometimes there's uranium and sand flying in the air. It's extraordinary. That's where the so-called yellow cake story comes from. Remember that? Yellow cake, uranium. Saddam Hussein has got yellow cake, uranium from, and then that husband of the CIA agent goes there and they says there's no, no yellow cake came to Saddam, and then they outed his wife. Remember her, Valerie Plame? CIA agent, that's Arlit in Niger. Nobody gives a shit about Arlit. They are interested in what happened to an American CIA agent. What about this poor town? 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 light bulbs in France is lit by that uranium mine. So the French, they have interest, they built a perimeter there. But French power is used benevolently. When the French invaded Mali in 2014, did anybody protest that? No, because they're going after Al-Qaeda. Really? It's Al-Qaeda? I don't think so. It's not the great story of our time. They have sold it to you as information war, that the great story of our time is Western liberalism versus Islamic fundamentalism. This is bullshit. The great story of our time is US imperialism with its French allies dominating Northern Africa. That's why they overthrew the government in Libya. It wasn't because Gaddafi was doing genocide. It's all nonsense. I mean, it's utterly Saudi propaganda. So, Russell, the first point is there is a presumption of Western benevolence. That's what Rafael Correa meant when he said there is American exceptionalism. He means Yanks believe their government at the end of the day. And if you have that affliction, if you believe that, you know, Joe Biden is going to do great things in the White House, Barack Obama just endorsed a series of New York Democrats. Guess who he didn't endorse in that list? Do you know who he didn't add to the list? Barack Obama. He did not endorse Ocasio-Cortez. So a great liberal hope, you know. Yes, Barack Obama. Oh, he's so great, we miss him. Seriously? He's the man who destroyed Libya. My friend, many friends died there. Most recently, my friend Ahmed was shot to death in the streets of Tripoli. Thanks, Barack. Thanks, Obama. Thanks, Hillary Clinton. Thanks, Sarkozy. Each one of you. The belief in the benevolence, Russell, of Western power is extraordinary. And it's very difficult to dent that. You know, you can say whatever you want. At the end of the day, people will say, look, we trust the American hand on the nuclear bomb. We don't trust the Russians. We don't trust Putin. Putin's a thug. Yes, Trump is a thug, but you know what? We'll come back to normal. The needle of normality will come back to Biden, and then it's all okay. Trump is an exception. No, he's not an exception. Trump is the rule. Trump is the rule. Trump is just a vulgar man, but he's the rule. He's vulgar. He's a hideous person. You know, he doesn't deserve to be leader of anything, but he's the rule. He's not the exception. You would like him to be the exception in order to maintain the sanctity of this idea that Western power is inherently benevolent. If you continue with that theory, forget it. You will never be able to talk about imperialism. Because at the end of the day, now, coming to the specific question of David Harvey and other people like that, there are great debates. John Smith, for instance, not an academic in the conventional sense, a trade union intellectual, wrote a terrific book on 21st century imperialism. I very much like it, published by Monthly Review Press. John is a trade unionist. He fights in a debate. It's like a bar brawl from Britain. I mean, he goes after Harvey. You know, American leftists do not want to cross David Harvey. David Harvey I mean, he's a friend of mine, you know, and I like him as a person, but his ideas are atrocious. And I agree, he's been taken out of context a little bit on this thing about, you know, there's no imperialism. I agree. If you listen to the whole interview, it's not exactly what he's saying. You know, there can be no revolution. Sorry, that new attack on Harvey. I think it's a little out of context. Anyway, there's no out of context when he says that imperialism is gone. He defends that. He says, yes, what about China? David, let's rethink, firstly, the concept imperialism. If you take the concept imperialism from Hobson, maybe a little bit Lenin, but mainly Hobson, and you look for that imperialism today, it's easy to say it doesn't exist. Because guess what? Imperialism is a dynamic structure. It's not going to be identical to the definition of something that existed in the 19th century. If you have concepts that are not dialectical, including with history inside them, then obviously you then have a kind of Kantian view of dynamics like imperialism. You have this sort of, Platonic view, sorry, not even Kant. Let's go back. You have a view, it's in the cave. There is an idea of imperialism. And the idea no longer exists, therefore there's no more imperialism. Sorry, I don't accept that imperialism is a static, ahistorical concept. It is a dynamic system. And therefore, our thinking has to be as dialectical as its historical development. Isn't that what Marxism is about? Our concepts are not static concepts. Our concepts are self-referential and historical. I thought when I read Marx, that's what I got out of it. that we are a self-referential, approach to the world. We have an understanding that our concepts are dialectical. By the way, when Lenin says concrete analysis of the concrete conditions, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about conjunctural analysis. I'm talking about our concepts have to be, themselves supple and have to regard the fact that history is not static. Correct? If you accept that, then if you have an out-of-date definition of imperialism and you start your book, putting the out-of-date definition, and then you look to reality and say, well, it doesn't account for reality, then obviously there's no imperialism. But I'm sorry, I disagree with your method. William Robinson and others who say, well, the world is flat, the elites are all the same. I don't agree with you at all. You don't understand how, I just recently sent a newsletter out, and I'm glad you mentioned it, Julio. In the newsletter, I mentioned the TDR from 2011, the UNCTAD Trade and Development Report. It's an excellent report. I interviewed Heiner Flassbeck, who was the chief economist at UNCTAD, for the newsletter. It came out today. You can see it on our website. I stole from Leonard Cohen for the title. You don't reach for the sky just to surrender, which is such a great line from Leonard Cohen's first album. I don't credit him, but he doesn't need to be credited. He's inside my head all the time. In the TDR, 2002 TDR, this is 2011, they mention how productive, the gains of trade are not going to the global south. And they have all the technical data for you, for those technical nuts to look at. There is no flat world. William Robinson and company are basically the Thomas Friedman of the left. If I can be rude, and I critiqued him in print. I don't think it's credible. They say it's not ultra imperialism. Kautsky's ultra imperialism. They say it's not that. Smells a lot like Kautsky and ultra imperialism to me. The elites they're not together. If you look at data from Davos, just Davos, some 70% of delegates at Davos come from Western countries. It's just because a handful of Indians show up, that doesn't mean that the Indian bourgeoisie is totally integrated to Wall Street. It's not. There are contradictions. So, this thing about what to do about it, just quickly 2 points. One is, two things to look at. One is there's a website called No Cold War. I'm part of the coordinating effort in this. We have a statement about the danger of the imposed war on China. Just take a look at it. It's an interesting statement. We are a wide group of people involved in this. The first thing is to try to rebalance the world, honestly. The end of US hegemony or end of US unipolarity, I think is very productive for the world. I wrote about BRICS at a time when BRICS seemed like they were going to push for multipolar world. I remember Patrick Bond and others saying, no, BRICS is sub-imperial. I'm not saying BRICS is, perfect. What we need is rebalancing of the world order. The appearance of China, Chinese theorists are talking about a bipolar world. They say we don't want to dominate the world. We're quite comfortable with the bipolar world. Two big countries organize the system. All that kind of stuff. We need rebalancing. I'm in favor of that. It's not socialism, but it's better than what we have now. The second thing is we need to build people's movements. I belong to a process. Our institute is rooted in a process called the International People's Assembly. We have about 200 organizations in the process from 100 countries, including Workers' Party of Tunisia, Communist Party of Nepal, the MST in Brazil, Patria Grande. Tons of movements are part of our process. It's a long process. Internationalism is not easy. We've been going for only 5 years. It started at a conference in Brazil called Dilemmas of Humanity, only in 2015. So, you got to build the strength of the people's movements. That's the only, we know that. To say that sounds silly.
Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you, Vijay. Barbara Foley. You need to unmute.
Here we go. Thank you. I had a terrible experience having my car towed in Queens today, so I'm a little traumatized. What an encounter with the state. Anyhow, thank you, Vijay, and thank you for so much of what you've been doing for many years. I'm a great fan, okay? And I particularly appreciate your absolute insistence upon talking about imperialism, okay? I want to be somewhat oppositional now in that while I very much appreciate what you're saying about, you know, the united front of oppressed peoples that you're trying to, you know, that you're talking about pulling together now, and it's crucially important. I think there's a danger in a certain kind of version of third worldism of saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, because, you know, there are ruling classes in all of these different countries, ruling elites, or not so ruling elites, but still, you know, representatives of the state who don't necessarily represent popular forces. So I'm just wondering, I have two questions, okay? One is, what's the prospect for worldwide international communism coming out of the mess of the present? And the second question, which is related though not indirectly, is what does one actually say about US versus Chinese rivalry? I read your recent piece on Monthly Review online, and what you had to say about Huawei tonight was really interesting. And, you know, while I am by no means an embracer of the William Robinson view of a transnational capitalist class, I think it's also not right, in line with what you're saying about, you know, bringing our concepts up to the present, that the model of inter-imperialist rivalry that we get out of Lenin doesn't really work for now. And I was just voyaging through Queens today as I was trying to recover my car, and so many of the companies that I passed had, you know, one title in English and one in Chinese. So it's clear that there's an imbrication of imperial, you know, of capitalist interests worldwide. So it's not so easy to talk about what US versus China imperialist rivalry would look like, except perhaps in this question of IT. And I'm just really wondering whether you think that conflict over IT might result in the kind of dramatic inter-imperialist rivalry that might move the world toward war, toward global war. So, you know, that's in one sense a more immediate question. On the other sense, you know, okay, what do we do with all of these nationalisms, more or less progressive, in terms of where we would like to be? I say we, I don't know. I think most of the people on this list here are communists and want to see, you know, the worldwide emancipation of the people of the creatures of the world from the yoke of capital. So where does the strategy that you're embracing right now fit into all of that? I guess these are pretty different questions, but in some degree they're interrelated. So, you know, run with it as much as you wish to. Thank you. Was that heard?
Yeah, Julio, what's the story? Shall I answer this? You want to take some questions? Julio, you're muted. You were shaking your finger, but you were muted. That was impressive.
I would like to read a text that was posted on the chat and hear your comment as you respond. It's by Fahim. Says, Vijay once mentioned, this is very interesting, in a documentary, the Cold War was very hot in the countries in the global South. So do you think that the Cold War that is being now pumped in the West between, you know, against China, will be fought on the backs of the peoples of the countries that lie along the Belt and Road, or on the backs of the resource-rich countries?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Barbara Foley. That's a mouthful of a question, and I'm sorry that you experienced that with your car. These kind of things, they may seem small, but man, it's terrible. It's like getting your pocket picked. It
right.
leaves you with
Big
a sense of violation. Yeah, it leaves you. I know what you mean. It's appalling. Right. I'm sorry for that. What is the prospect of worldwide communism? Asked Barbara Foley. Well. So there's many ways to talk about this. Right now, I'm just going to tell you, Barbara, I don't presume to have an oracular view of this. I'm just going to tell you, because the way you asked it is, you know, in a way, where do your feet land in the terrain of this question? So let me answer from that perspective. For 30 plus years, I've been a member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. our party, is 1 million people in India, million cadre member. It's a very small party for the scale of India. Our party is in government in Kerala. We have a superb government which handled the COVID-19 crisis with impeccable scientific rigor and with public action on the streets by our trade unions, women's movement, student movement, and so on. Extremely important that I make the point to us all today that in the socialist countries where socialists are in government, including in Venezuela, and I'm willing to have a debate about that. I have debated, people have said to me, it's not a socialist government. I mean, come on, come off it. Get off your pony now. In these countries, the mass organizations of the Socialist Party have been on the street delivering relief to people, testing people. For God's sake, 29,000 medical students left their dorms in Cuba and went and tested every one of the 11 million Cuban citizens. I don't think in the United States, even trade unions have been doing relief. I don't think so. I've not heard a damn thing that any of the US trade unions have been on the streets feeding people, making sure elderly have got medicines and so on. I have not seen anything. I don't know about you. Not seen one thing written by anybody. And I looked for it. I haven't seen anything in the UK of anything of this caliber. Mass organizations out. They're just very decent, well-minded small groups of people doing mutual aid. That's it, at not even near scale. So what is the possibility of communism in the world? Let's first look at what our people are doing. And I will tell you that one of the other challenges I would pose to all of you is we need to be writing more about what our people are doing. One of the missions of Tricontinental is to amplify the voices of intellectuals of our movements. I mean, trade union leaders, the leader of the India's trade union, Hemlata, she is an incredible person. She's the leader of one of the largest federations in India. We interviewed her last year for one of our dossiers. It's a really interesting interview because she talks about how to organize informal workers and so on. You read so many people in these journals, academic journals, who don't have any touch with the new intellectuals of our epoch, what Gramsci called the new intellectuals. That is trade union leaders of the South, peasant organizers. We just don't go and talk to people. Our researchers show up there to write PhDs, and they are the ones who essentially absorb, just like the International Division of Labor, they will absorb knowledge, come back, and it's their property now. Why not use your post to amplify the voices of people who are doing something, trying to build what you called, Barbara, the prospect of worldwide communism. It's being built by these intellectuals. Harvey once said that the world revolution will happen with Western intellectuals and Southern workers. The arrogance of that statement is dumbfounding. Because an intellectual is not just somebody with a PhD at an academy. Sorry, when I read Gramsci carefully, he says everybody's an intellectual. Every social strata has their own intellectuals. There are some intellectuals who have their prestige because of their post. That's a traditional intellectual. And then there are permanent persuaders. That's Gramsci's phrase. And that's the communist. That's a new intellectual. Why not pay attention to that? So that's what I would say. I already talked about the International Assembly of the People. I'm involved in that project. I'm very pleased with the development. To have a set of meetings where people travel and meet from places like Nepal, from South Africa, from Tunisia, Morocco, from Spain, and we have serious discussions about strategy, internationalism, solidarity. The Socialist Party of Zambia, which is running a very difficult presidential election. My friend Fred Mmembe is the candidate for president. He was an editor of a newspaper, terrific person. I very much hope he can win. But Launda, for instance, is a thug, the current president of Zambia. They will not allow a free election there. So I'm just saying that there are movements and developments, and we know that the prospect question must always begin with what is there. Not what do I think in my head. What is there? We always begin with what is there. And what is there teaches us there's a lot there. There's a lot there. When I look at Brazil, the MST currently is struggling to protect 2 settlements up for eviction under the fascist government of Bolsonaro. Our solidarity with the Brazilian left must be there. They have a campaign tomorrow on the 7th of August called Fora Bolsonaro, an online campaign. I hope you will join it. #Fora Bolsonaro. Get Bolsonaro the hell out of there. I'm writing a story. It'll be out next week about it. You'll see it also at Monthly Review. It's a story about the Brazilian trade unions, which have a criminal complaint against Bolsonaro in the ICC, charging him with crimes against humanity. Be there with the Brazilian trade unions. We have to stand and deliver. This is important to me. And I agree with you, Barbara, that this is not a situation where there are no scoundrels in our countries. Of course, I agree with you. Implicitly, I agree with you. I agree with both things. I agree with the fact that there are scoundrels in all these countries, whether they are comprador or they are at the high table or whatever. But that doesn't change the fact that there is a geographical division of labor. And it doesn't change the fact that there are wretched conditions in some of these countries, and that there are creamy layers of a labor aristocracy in other countries that benefit of this geography of imperialism, which exists and persists and is reproduced. So I agree with that entirely. I mean, to critique the idea of the flat world, left flat world, isn't to come back and say, we are in the 1940s and it's the third world versus the first world. It's that too, but also we have to settle accounts with ourselves. Remember, Fanon wrote his book at that time. And the chapter in Wretched of the Earth called Pitfalls of National Consciousness was already saying that. We are aware of that. Lumumba understood that. After all, Lumumba was also killed by Mobutu, and that section of Katanga elites who wanted the copper to benefit them. We know that that's there. We are not going to be naive about it, but nonetheless, there is a geography. I feel strongly that the Cold War is not a Cold War even. This is a hybrid war. It's a different situation. In Washington Bullets, I make the argument, I may be totally wrong, that the periodization of pre-Cold War, Cold War, and post-Cold War is totally wrong. There is a great process of history from the late part of the 19th century till today. And that's a long fight between the forces of decolonization and the forces of domination. This is a long battle that transcends the divisions of Cold War, post-Cold War. This is a long dialectical fight which has not been settled in anybody's favor yet. And therefore, look, Nepal, it's a small country, a poor country. It has a communist government, which has 66% of the parliament is communists. I mean, it's incredible. It's a total majority of political power in Nepal. Cannot move an agenda. Do you know why? It's suffocated by India on one side, which keeps closing the border. It's a landlocked country. On the other side is China, with which it has fraternal relations, but also the Himalayas. On the other side of the Himalayas, in the province of Mustang, they've discovered an enormous trove of uranium. It's very high quality uranium. Now, the Americans have showed up and said, we'll give you $500 billion through a Millennium Challenge MCC, Millennium Challenge Community, I don't know what it is, some fancy thing, MCC, Millennium Challenge something, grant to build electric power lines. Nothing to do with the Mustang thing and nothing to do with the fact that we want you in the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is the Quad countries plus, Quad being India, Japan, Australia, and the United States plus is the Indo-Pacific strategy led by Admiral Davidson, a real piece of work. US government Indo-Pacific strategy document is called Regain the Advantage. Come on, guys. There's no imperialism. Regain the advantage. There's no imperialism. This is published and available on the State Department and Pentagon website. There is no imperialism. Regain the advantage. What advantage, you might ask, and for whom? Well, for humanity, obviously. It's about human rights. Regain the advantage for human rights. For the UN Charter, actually. Sorry, I misspoke. Nothing as amorphous as human rights. It's to regain the advantage for the UN Charter, which the United States, as you know, is the upholder and defender of that charter. Yes, which was entirely written by Eleanor Roosevelt. Nobody else participated. That's the liberal imperialist view. So anyway, the point I want to make, is this point about, is it going to be fought in the South, the so-called Cold War? No, but the battlefield is always been and has always been these regions. I mean, the case of the African continent is very interesting. This argument that China is a colonial power is so interesting, how this argument is being made. I mean, I remember in the FT, central bank head of Ghana, about maybe 15 years ago, wrote a piece saying that we know who the colonialists were. That's all he said in his letter. He said, we know who the colonialists were. He used the word were. I contested that word. Seriously? We know who the colonialists were? You mean they are not? I mean, literally, the French franc is used in all the so-called francophone countries, and France will not allow them to create their own currency. You may remember Gaddafi floated the idea of the Afrique. You know what happened to him. I mean, who was the first country to bomb under Resolution 1973? Not the United States. It was Sarkozy's French planes that first went in under the flag of NATO to bomb in Libya. Gaddafi was a pain in the ass. He had funded Sarkozy's re-election campaign. His money brought Sarkozy back. Boy, don't fund these scoundrels. They will kill you. And they did.
Okay, so we have, we have to keep the questions short, and I guess the responses also, Vijay. So we have Darian next.
Hello, I wanted to say first, that's a great Paul Robeson poster, Barbara, behind you. And then I wanted to thank you for your time, Vijay. As one of the few Americans of Zambian descent, I wanted to know what you were doing with the Socialist Party in Zambia and what their views on Chinese imperialism, if you want to call it that. If you were there during the attack in the textile factory on the Chinese foreman, where some Zambian workers Chinese in and attacked the Chinese foreman and burned them.
Darian, your connection is poor, and I'm getting bits of it, but I just want to be clear what you're saying. I wonder if you could just repeat or write in the chat what you're saying. Your connection is spotty. I got the first part. Zambian descent. What were you doing with the Socialist Party of Zambia? What is your view on the textile factory attack, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I was just going to ask you, can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you, what if any kind of presence from U.S. AFRICOM are in Zambia or in that area in general, and what is their response? And what did Macron's appearance in Beirut and his statements there, kind of as like a French colony, so after this like terrible industrial accident. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Darian. Steve?
Hi, Vijay. Thank you for the lively discussion. I'm definitely going to be sure to check out your book. So I guess this might touch a bit more on, again, like what is to be done. So I was thinking about, the rise and fall of like leftist and democratically elected regimes in Latin America and the Caribbean and across the world. Well, in the 1950s, there was a Cuban Revolution quite close to the imperial core, and they seemed to hold on this entire time, fending off Washington bullets. So I'm wondering if there's anything to like take from what they've done as maybe being prescriptive towards what could be done going forward.
Okay, Vijay, hold the horses. Let's go on with Ryan, and then Sean, and then you wrap it up, okay? So Ryan.
Hey, Vijay, thanks for being here and having this talk. My connection was kind of cutting out, so I'm not sure if you addressed this, but you were talking about the blockade of Venezuela. And I was wondering what kind of larger regional implications that might have for places like Trinidad or Guyana in that naval move.
Thank you, Ryan. Sean?
Hi, Vijay. Thanks for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. I really also enjoyed the numerous tricontinental newsletters that you send regularly. My often conversations with my U.S. colleagues, I do have the frustration of, somehow I was living in the early 20th century, speaking to the Second International people, that, they somehow thought that imperialism is going to be good for the humankind. It's going to, in the end, would make socialism happen somehow. But at the 100 years ago, we were in a very different situation. We had Lenin, we had Comintern, we had a visible global communist movement. But right now, we don't really have what we had, back then. So my question to you, on a more concrete level, is how, especially for people from the South, in the South, how do we make the crucial connection among ourselves, among the working class? Despite the fact that every national government right now is trying to use some kind of nationalist propaganda to indoctrinate the working class. And that could be dangerous. It happened in China, it happened in India. So I wonder what your thoughts about this. Thank you.
Vijay,
okay,
wrap
these
it up.
three and then in a ball. Okay, great. No, four. I won't go in any order. I mean, I'll make up my own order. First, Ryan, these countries are part of the ALBA bloc. The ALBA bloc still exists. Trinidad is a major part of it. It's going to be impossible for the US to no. Oh God, let me put it differently. I shouldn't put it like this. There is no need for the United States government to have an act of war. That's what Elliot Abrams said on the 4th of August, 2020, before a US Senate committee. There is no need for an act of war. They don't want to do an act of war. If you can get everything you want without an act of war, why would you do an act of war? Because after all, if you do an act of war, then maybe we can say imperialism. You see, if you can just deny Venezuela its legitimate gold sitting in the Bank of London, if you can deny Venezuela the right to IMF lending, which is the COVID-19 fund that the IMF Director General, I think, very generously provided out of her own pocket, it seems, her generosity is. If you can deny Venezuela the right to free trade with people and so on, why do you need an act of war? Because somehow all these other things are not seen as an act of war. This is interesting. This actually should have us reassess what an act of war is. Venezuela has put its money in the Bank of London. I don't know why they did that. Chavez should have removed it. I think it's a gross error. Have all that gold flown out of the Bank of London. But they also assumed that somehow Bank of London will follow, the laws of property and so on. Basic laws that, Volume 1 of Capital, Marx says that until, prejudices of equality, the contradictions of the commodity form may not transpire. He says the prejudice of equality must be there, but it also requires a prejudice of private property. Well, apparently that can be violated at whim. And hello, imperialism. It can be violated at whim. And you can say Juan Guaido, who's recognized by 60 countries, 193 in the world, somehow that's a contested sovereignty. You see, that I called the IMF after they denied Venezuela the right. I wrote, Paula Estrada, Ana Maldonado, Zoe, and I wrote this whole series on Venezuela and the hybrid war during pandemic. We did it as a study from Tricontinental. You can read the whole study. I called the IMF, talked to the spokesperson, said, why did you in 24 hours deny their request coming from Venezuela? And he said, well, there's a contest over who is the legitimate government. And I said, but listen, 60 countries you're saying to me have recognized Guaido, but 133 countries have not recognized Guaido. So that seems to me, if I'm right about the mathematics, it's 2/3 to 1/3. I may be bad at mathematics because I'm sorry, the United States is one of the 60. So that's 1,000 million trillion gazillion votes. And so 1,000 gazillion million trillion votes plus 59 is obviously more than 133. So my math, I actually said that to him. And he laughed and he said, you'll print whatever you want anyway, because he talks to me all the time. He said, you'll print what you want anyway. And I wish I could have written that line. And then the IMF spokesperson said, you'll print what you want anyway. But I didn't. I mean, I printed, said, they've denied them. So if you can strangle somebody and leave no marks of strangulation, And people are saying, oh, they're not strangling them. They're just sitting there and touching their forehead gently and trying to soothe them to sleep, but they're actually strangling them, and you leave no marks. Why would you like to leave marks on the neck? Please, Moira, is it Moira? Please don't strangle him. I saw you practicing. He doesn't look like a strangleable person. In fact, I'm not sure who's strangleable, but I saw that. That shocked me. Communists strangling each other on tape. Anyway, okay, Ryan, right? It would be something that would be difficult to do. So I think it's not a real question in a way, right, Ryan? They're not going to do it. At People's Dispatch, a very good website, you will see a series of articles on Haiti and Venezuela and the hybrid war. This is important because Petrocaribe, which was a project started by Chavez to provide oil at cut prices to places like Haiti, has been destroyed by the attack on Venezuela. And Haiti, the uprising in Haiti last year was entirely a consequence of the hybrid war against Venezuela. And the Haitian people know that because they've been in their protests, you will see them carrying Venezuelan flags. This is a rebellious people, my friend. They were the first proletarian revolution in world history. Late 18th century, and don't let anybody call it a slave rebellion. That's ridiculous. It's a proletarian uprising. These were agricultural workers. Just because somebody is not paid doesn't make them not part of the working class. Sorry. That means women who work to socially reproduce, they are not part of the working class. It's the old attitude, you know, the worker and his wife. Sorry, it's not like that. That's not how we understand the working class. I don't know what kind of left-wing thinker thinks like that. There is no such thing as the worker and his wife, you know, or the textile worker in England and the slave. And no, that's ridiculous. These are part of the international working class of that era. And the Haitians were the first major proletarian revolution. They worked, after all, in a factory. It just happened to be outdoors in a field. Just because there's no roof doesn't make it not a factory. I mean, how silly are we, right? So anyway, that's my soapbox on that, Ryan. Let's go to Zambia, then we'll come to Cuba, and then Shun, fantastic question. Let's get to your question last. Good way to wrap the whole thing. Don't you agree? Yes, okay. So Zambia. The Socialist Party of Zambia is part of the International People's Assembly process. They've been there since the beginning. You know, Fred is a very, as I said, a newspaper editor and journalist. The party is building from scratch, virtually, because in the last 15 or so years, the socialist project in Zambia was destroyed. Now, we can discuss later, Darian, the question of Kenneth Kwanda and Kwanda's own legacy and blah, blah, blah. And Darian, you know very well exactly the way the discussion will go. I don't know how much we'll agree about Kwanda, but I'm sure we'll agree on a lot. You know, just because somebody starts well doesn't mean they end well. Okay, I know that. I know. Hello, Mugabe. Hello, Robert Mugabe. I see you. But on the other hand, just because you end badly doesn't mean you should be pilloried. I also believe that. And that's how I approach Gaddafi, for instance. These are complicated legacies. And they must be understood in their complexity. You know, why do we accept that Thomas Jefferson is complicated? A man who had people who he had as his human property, his teeth in his mouth were from their mouths, pulled out when they were alive and put into his mouth. I mean, that's grotesque, man. Gaddafi never did that. Mugabe never did that. Kenneth Kwanda never did that. Somehow, Thomas Jefferson requires balance, but not Kenneth Kwanda. Imagine, John F. Kennedy requires balance, even adulation. A man who tried to destroy the Cuban Revolution. I'll get to that in a minute. Steve, right? I'll get to that in a minute. Cuban Revolution. Somehow, John F. Kennedy can get balance and even adulation, but definitely not Gaddafi. Amazing world we live in, guys. Amazing. Startles me. John F. Kennedy, you know, think of the things he did. What about Vietnam? Welcome to the life of Ho Chi Minh. I'm editing a book on selected Ho Chi Minh writings. For the first time coming out of Vietnamese are Ho Chi Minh's lectures in 1927 delivered in China. It's going to be a great book. You know, it'll come out hopefully in September or October from Leftward in India. Anyway, That's the Socialist Party. There was an attack at a textile factory in June, I think, right? I think 8 Chinese business people were killed. Sure, I mean, this happens all over the world. There are uprisings of workers and others, and they kill bosses. It happened in Chennai. There was an attack on a factory. The boss was killed. Now, how much do you read into that, Darian? That's the issue. 8 Chinese businessmen killed in Zambia. Do we read that as the mood of Africa, Darian? You see, 3 men came in and killed them. That's what I read in the press at the time. I may be wrong, Darian. I think it was 3 men. Is that the mood of Africa? 3 men killed 8 Chinese businessmen. I think we should be cautious. It's complicated. And I don't use the word complicated to duck a question. I mean that the mediations have to be much deeper. You know, we can't take one story and then have no mediations and say Africans hate Chinese. What are the mediations? What are the other things happening? You know, what are other stories? And I'm not talking about nuance here. I hate the word nuance because I know it's used in a way to destroy clear thinking. I'm talking about mediations, another familiar Marxist category. I hope all of you, science and society, the word mediations should be very familiar to you. Well, you may not any longer read Dialectics of Nature. So I'm not sure if you bother to trudge through Engels. I'm not sure if it's compulsory reading anymore, Dialectics of Nature. I'm very happy. I just got John Bellamy Foster's new book, big giant book on nature. I'm really excited to read it. It's a sort of prehistory of Engels' Dialectics of Nature, it seems. Anyway, whatever. Mediations, Darian. We need mediations. We need to understand much more empirical research needs to be conducted. Again, not to duck the question, Darian, but because it's not precise to take one incident and to judge a process based on that incident. It could have been a robbery gone bad. We still don't know, and we don't know because the Zambian government is not going to prosecute the case properly. They don't want to do anything about this. You know, they just don't want to. So therefore, we won't even know about this case, Darian. Forget about unmediated conversation about China in Africa. That's a much bigger question. Zambia is not enough to sustain that question. Let's go to Tanzania. Let's go to Angola. Let's also look at Equatorial Guinea, you know, places which are genuinely horrendous. Governments are horrendous, collaborating with the worst elements. Let's look there. What will we find? Okay, Darian, it's not a perfect answer, but it's a methodological answer. I just don't have the evidence. Steve asked a great question. You know, Steve, I will tell you, I've been many times accused of being on the payroll of the Cuban government. It's true that the institute I lead is named after a conference held in Havana in 1966. It's also true that the OSPAL, which was the heir of the conference, the Organization in Solidarity of the People of Africa, Asia, Latin America, closed down last year. It's true we started just when OSPAL closed, but we are not funded by the Cuban government, although I wouldn't, I would move to Havana tomorrow and set up our office there. I have a great love and respect for the Cuban Revolution, for the Cuban people, for their struggle. And I think that the example is not in Cuba, it's in Guatemala. Che Guevara was a young person. And by the way, Che Guevara learned his Marxism from his first wife, who was a Peruvian Marxist who he lived with in Guatemala. It's something not often talked about. She was really the teacher, his teacher of Marxism. You know, he doesn't get Marxism from his training as a doctor, for sure. They are studying Marx together in Guatemala when the coup against Arbenz takes place. Che and you know, in the house, they try to defend the regime in their small way, you know, running out in the streets and so on. Obviously, they see what happens. When he meets Fidel in Mexico, 54, 55, 56, just before they get on the Granma, so must be 56, I think, 56. I think he meets Fidel in 56 in Mexico. One of their first conversations is about Guatemala and Arbenz. And what Che says is, you know, I was amazed that Arbenz didn't arm the trade unions even. His great allies were the trade unions, and even the Communist Party was not prepared to come to the streets. When Castillo Armas arrives on the border of Guatemala, he's sitting at the border. In the initial period, the army is actually doing a good job holding him back. The CIA was relatively incompetent, flying planes and dropping bombs, blew up a fuel tank in Guatemala City. You know, it was not going well. And Arbenz at that point was being told by the communist leader, arm the people, give a speech. And he just didn't. He was a Democrat, you know, small d Democrat. And Che watched all this, and they discussed this at length in the Sierra Maestra. You know, I mean, I don't know if you know the work of Mabel Hernandez. She was a terrific person. Mabel Hernandez and Hedy Santa Maria were the two women involved in the attack on Moncada. Mabel Hernandez was studying what the Vietnamese were doing, what Ho Chi Minh was doing. She later is the Cuban ambassador to Vietnam, which was in the jungle. You know, they made the embassy in the jungle. It's a fantastic story. She's a terrific person and needs to be more written about. She edits the first volume of Ho Chi Minh's political writings in Havana, published in '73. Anyway, Mabel Hernandez and others, they're discussing in the Sierra Maestra, what you got to do is win the people on your side. In the Soviet Union, the reason they fought off the attack was they did land reform immediately. And then when the White Army appears and the nobles come on their horses and say, join us against the evil communists, the people say to them, why should we fight on your side so you can take the land back? This is what they discussed in the Sierra Maestra. It's a wonderful education they had with each other. And so, you know, the Committee to Defend the Revolution is basically almost every Cuban citizen. It is one of the most terrific projects of the Cuban Revolution. You don't need a big standing army when every single 11 million people in Cuba is part of the defense of the revolution. At his speech in October 1953, which is known as History Will Absolve Me, Castro says, once a people hungry for freedom win freedom, they will never give it up without a fight. But comrade, once you win freedom, you got to give people freedom. You can't rule in their name. Cuban Revolution is one of the most extraordinary revolutions. If you travel in Cuba, you will see a people so dignified. You know, the only other time I've experienced this, frankly, is Burkina Faso, before the death of Sankara. When, you know, look at what Sankara does, okay? He changes the name of that country from Upper Volta, which is a disgusting colonial name north of the Volta River, to Burkina Faso, which means land of upright people. Dignity and control of your, I mean, that's what a revolution is, comrade. Revolution isn't just bread and butter. Revolution is about dignity. And Cuban Revolution gave the 11 million Cubans dignity, and they will not give it up. 90 miles from Miami, they don't give a shit. They will not allow what happened to Arbenz to happen to their country, even today, even with all the trouble. Guess what? Go back and read, Steve. Just do this as a, please, I'm asking you to do this, okay? You won't do it, but do it anyway, Stephen. 2 speeches. Castro was the master of analyzing, dialectician of analyzing adversity into victory. Please read 2 sets of speeches after the 1970 failed Cuban sugarcane harvest, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Castro was an amazing new intellectual. He could absorb a condition of total defeat, and he could explain to the people, the Cuban people, with dignity, comrades, this is our defeat. Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. Amilcar Cabral at Havana, Cuba, 1966. A great line. Tell no lies. Castro would say, we have been defeated by the sugarcane harvest, comrades, but this is how it's a victory. We are going to learn to diversify. I mean, he is a master. And we need that today. We are in a condition of long-term defeat. To win, we need to analyze defeat and see victory in its jaws. That's the genius of the Cuban Revolution. They will never give up. Finally, now, one of the things, Shun, what you said, okay, I'm coming to your question last as the wrap up, as Julio said. One of the most difficult things to be on the, I joined the CPIM, my party, roundly critiqued by lots of people. Many years, people will tell, you're a Stalinist, you're a this, it's okay, it's fine. I joined the CPIM just when the Soviet Union was collapsing. Okay, guys, this is how insane I am. Gorbachev was doing his ridiculous project of glasnost and perestroika. These are all joke words. He was like a clown who put the red nose on his thing and ran around saying words that everybody repeated as if they were going to solve the intractable problems that the USSR had gone into, frankly. USSR had many opportunities to reform stagnation. They simply didn't do it. I mean, for whatever reason. Maybe they just stopped listening to people. The leadership became a little sclerotic. You know, I mean, I don't know what, I don't have a good theory. I mean, we've published lots of books at Leftward trying to analyze this. I just ordered Bahman Azad's book, which was published by international publishers years ago. I hadn't read it in years. I thought I'll read it again. I don't know where my copy is. I ordered another one from some used book site because it's out of print. You know this book? Some great struggle, dashed hopes or something, you know. Anyway, I joined the party when the Soviet Union was basically on its last legs, Ju, okay? For all these years, I've been a disciplined member of a communist party. Even now, I'm speaking to you with a great sense of admiration for my comrades, for my party, for what they've given me. And what my party has given me is clarity. It's given me discipline. It's given me energy. I learn from my comrades. There is nothing better than being linked to a political organization where my comrades are out there every day in touch with agricultural workers, every day in touch with Anganwadi workers, that is creche workers, every day in touch with factory workers, dock workers, every day in touch with students. I'm in a party where I, through our party channels, through our discussions, through our every periodic conferences and so on, I learn about how our party is digesting and trying desperately to understand a fast changing reality. The reason I will never back down from the positions I hold, and I don't mean it dogmatically, Ju, because I'm not a dogmatic person. And actually, my party is also not dogmatic. It's extremely open-ended. I mean, one of our main intellectuals is Prabhat Patnaik. Many of you are familiar with Prabhat's writings. Utsa Patnaik, you're familiar with Utsa's writings. We are not dogmatic people, actually. We are open to the dialectic of change. We understand that, and we keep trying to analyze reality in order to, learn from our comrades who have a better touch of the question of praxis and build a theory out of the work we all do together. So what I'm trying to say, Ju, is that you have to hold the line. And what's the line that you hold? The line I hold is I believe fundamentally in the emancipation of the people of the earth. I believe fundamentally in that. I believe capitalism is a rotten, decayed system that cannot emancipate people. I believe fundamentally in that. And I have faith in the idea of organization. Lenin's line is often quoted by Marxists, and other radicals use it. The line is, there can be no, what's it called? No political, there can be no theory without practice. You know that line from, there can be no revolutionary theory without revolutionary practice. Or is it the other way around? No revolutionary, well, it's actually goes both ways. Actually, the line is inadequate, and Comrade Lenin made a mistake because he didn't realize memes would be made of it. And people wouldn't read the whole book in which it appears. The book in which it appears is, as you know, What is to be Done from 1903. And you can't make a meme of a whole book. The actual line is, there can be no revolutionary practice rooted in an organization and, revolutionary theory. I'm mixing the whole line up, but you get the point. The mediation between theory and practice is organization. That's not in the quote, because he assumes it. The whole book is about the necessity of organization. You understand what I'm saying? The context in which he has the line about theory and practice is in a book about organization, a book about the need for a political party, essential need for a political party. So, I mean, if you're not part of an organization, what kind of Marxist are you? I'm asking an honest, not a bad question. It would be easy for me to have abandoned my party, walked away, and been an independent intellectual. So easy. There's so many accolades you can win. People criticize you. Oh, you are CPIM. Oh, this. Oh, well, yes, I am. I'm proud of it. I never hide it. What is there to be embarrassed about? I'm a member of a communist party that struggles to build human emancipation. You have to hold the line, Ju. But what line are you holding? what happens, I see this happening a lot to independent intellectuals, is the drift is extraordinary. There's a riptide, that runs through intellectual activity. You can get dragged away from that to all kinds of things, to all kinds of concessions and collaborations, and you can move away. You cannot, I believe, be a Marxist. I believe after Lenin, and even indeed from the beginning, it's impossible to be a Marxist without a party. For God's sake, even Edward Bernstein was in a party. Edward Bernstein wasn't a professor at Jena. Edward Bernstein was in the German Social Democratic Party. Now, he took a scoundrelous position in the party, but I respect him. He was in a party and he was in an inner party debate, and his position was roundly destroyed by Rosa Luxemburg, the great Red Rosa. But at least Bernstein was in a party. People that I read in many of the journals are in not any organization. They write as individuals. How can I take them seriously? Where is your party, comrade? Last thing I'll say, Julio, and then I'll leave you, is from my very favorite American playwright, living playwright, is from him, is Tony Kushner. And it's from a play which you know, Angels in America, but part 2, the play Perestroika. Do you remember this Perestroika? It's a lovely play. It's part 2 of Angels in America. And unfortunately, it's not well known. In Perestroika, it opens in the Great Hall of the People. It's the last years of the USSR. And Comrade Antediluvievich, it's a great name. Comrade Antediluvievich arrives to argue the case against the NEP men, against the Gorbachev crowd. I mean, Tony Kushner is a genius, honestly. The whole of Angels in America is an amazing play. I don't know if you've all seen it. You should watch the movie if you haven't seen it. He really pillories that, what's his name? Cohen. What's his first name? Roy Cohen? Roy Cohen. Yeah, he pillories. Boy, he does a number on Roy Cohen in that. That's the godfather of Trump. So it's a good time to rewatch Angels in America, honestly, because he is the godfather of Trump, almost literally. So Antediluvievich arrives at the Great Hall of the People. And, they're discussing, these great words, perestroika and glasnost, all bullshit, empty words. And they're discussing all this. And here comes Antediluvievich. And he stands up. You can imagine him on a cane, maybe. He stands up and he says, listen, I've heard all of you talking, you NEP men, he says, you puny people. He says, he said, when I was young, we stood on the mountain and we saw the shining sun of socialism. He says, that was our theory. We had a theory, comrades. We had a theory. Comrades, and he said, we had a theory. He says, you NEP men, you puny shadows of what we were. He says, what is your theory? He says to them, what is your theory? He says, if you had a theory, I would follow you. And then comes my favorite line. He says, even a snake, when it sheds its skin, has before that grown a new one. Have you, my little serpents, a new skin? Thanks a lot. Okay.
You can unmute and applaud. I was going to tell a story about the fact of the Australian travels and all that, but I think we should wrap it up because it's late in the Eastern United States. So thanks again from the heart, on behalf of Science and Society for your participation.
Anytime. Nice to be with you. Okay. Bye. Thanks. Bye.